Hi all. Yifan Hou is doing incredibly well in the Tradewise Gibraltar event. She's leading the event at the moment. This was her round 7 game, I believe, against Judit Polgar, who is the top rated FIDE player in the world. So Judit Polgar, one of the 3 Polgar sisters, that were trained apparently with many trainers day and night for many years by their father, who was like using it as an experiment that you don't necessarily have to have natural talent. You can get there by training, and the Polgars have done exceptionally well in chess. Okay, so Judit playing in Gibraltar, playing black against Yifan Hou, the official current women's world champion, and really showing at 2605 she actually might be considerably underrated by the performance of this tournament so far. Okay, so e4, c5 by Judit, Sicilian fighting talk, knight f3, now e6. Okay, now e6, you might not expect me to say much about it, but I'm going to say something about it. It's weakening some dark squares, of course, in this variation. And actually we're going to see a lot of white strategy in this game revolving around seemingly like freezing off black's pawn structure for bits to drop off. I've played through this game a few times and I get that impression. So I think it's more than just restrain, blockade, destroy. You can look at a different metaphor for the pattern of this game, as though the fluidity of Judit Polgar's pawn structure later is like frozen solid and then munched. So we're going to witness that. But note the weaknesses on the dark squares during this game, the course of this game. So d4, cd, knight d4. Now knight c6, challenging the knight. Knight doesn't go anywhere, just knight c3, inviting if black wants maybe to pin the knight, but that's not taken up. Just a6. So now we've got other dark square weaknesses, but this is typical of this variation. Sometimes this knight might want to go to e7, and then or other stuff is very interesting. But note the idea of freezing black's pawn structure solid at some point. So bishop e7, knight does come now to e7 to be able to recapture maybe if knight takes c6, without putting more pawns on light squares. Bishop f4, but now actually there is an invitation to put another pawn on the light square, or maybe the same pawn if black wants to recapture like this, which is unlikely because doesn't want the queen to be taken perhaps here. So knight g6. So after knight takes, b takes, well, same number of pawns on light squares, it's just moved position. Okay, we've got a lot of pawns on light squares, and hence we've got these dark square weaknesses. So just observe this, and so it's logical for white now to exchange off black's dark square bishop, as though like a Dutch stonewall, where black would have a pawn usually on d5. But here we've still got a lot of pawns on light squares, dark square liability. So bishop d6, exchanging off the dark square defender. Bishop d6, queen d6, queen e7. White's position is already very pleasant at this opening, and white doesn't mind an exchange of queens. There's persistence, solid, nagging edge here after casting queenside, I would argue. Biased, of course, by the course of the game. So queen takes d6, rook takes d6. So white can freely double against d7, but you might think that's pointless. It's defended. What is the rook doing there? Well, it's tying black down. There's a lot of restraints going on here. Black's counterplay is severely limited. Rook hd1. Now an interference tactic might be on the cards, you'd think, to try and snatch the exchange. So this looks as though this might be dangerous now. Knight f4 to be able to go to d5 has to be factored in after bishop f3, which was also attacking the g2 pawn. I don't think knight d5 works particularly well. I think it would be exchange sack time. Let's have a quick look at it here. It wasn't played in the game. Let's reduce the number of lines here to 3. So if knight d5, just trying to interrupt the protection, just simply taking taking, and initially Houdini likes black slightly. Oh dear. C takes d7. Maybe there's something deeper here. Bishop b7. It's too deep for an engine. Clearly. The exchange sack. Bishop takes. King takes. Now slightly better for white after a4. What's going on here? So it's a bit of a murky position. The exchange down. So that does seem quite interesting. The idea of knight d5 is not completely ludicrous. It's actually coming out as one of the top options here. If there's any flaw with white connecting the rooks here to protect each other, this knight d5 is literally throwing a spanner in the works of the protection anyway, to keep this loose, make this loose. Okay, another alternative though, e5 might be better than ed. Okay, e5. No, ed? I think ed or e5, I don't know. Ed is probably preferable to go in for this. Alright, let's go back to the game. In the game, actually rook b8 was chosen by Judit. Okay, the rook comes out now, because it's probably getting more powerful to play knight d5 at some point. It's going to be more powerful, more effective. Doesn't want to stay there with that option continually open. g5, right, as though maybe there's some restraint on white playing breaks like f4 or h4 might have been useful. Knight a4, now d5. So notice knight a4, eyeing these dark squares. g3, evicting the knight back. Rook e1. So now there's a threat, ed, and takes bishop d5 maybe. It's a nasty pin. King has to get out of that e-file, the X-ray attack. So here black plays king f6, and now this is going to be the more agile piece, able to go to different colours on the chessboard. So why not get rid of it? Bishop h5, giving the options get rid of it, but it doesn't have to be taken up immediately in this position, because the rook will be active on h2 here. So for the moment, actually, Judit just counterattacks the knight here. Now knight c3, actually, not b3. So let's check this out. Would b3 have been a viable alternative, or even knight c5? Actually, knight c5 is coming up as one of the recommendations here. Rook c4, knight b3, and that's okay for white. Even if white does sack a pawn here, I don't think that's a big deal. You can get it back, maybe. Or there's a lot of pressure, rather. a4. Fixing down this bishop with a5 looks like a great positional plan. So white would be a tiny bit better, apparently, but it's not really much in it there. So also, let's check out b3, just sacking the pawn like that. There's probably not much in it again, either way. So b4, okay, it's about equal. So in the game, anyway, the knight just retreated, protecting the pawn officially. No temporary pawn sack. d4, but now a temporary pawn sack with e5. So it's as if this plan was quite versatile, that the bishop didn't really have to take on g6 at all. Instead, the plan's changed with this check now, and now knight takes g5. Okay. So Judit has this knight attacked, and instead of moving it, actually attacks white's knight. And you might wonder why. What's going on here that the knight cannot just move somewhere? Isn't that possible? Knight g6. Seems white's advantage has crapped up ever so slightly from a technical point of view in the sequence we've just observed, actually. And knight g6, there's a kind of frontal attack against the king here. f4, and all of a sudden f5 might be on the cards, with e6 looking a bit weak. So maybe this knight c3 had something going for it. If we just look what happened there, evaluation shifts. Was d4 the right move? Maybe that could have been a bit too committal, d4. Perhaps Engine's suggestion there was like king g7 or a5. So possibly d4 was committal and e5 was the right move to exploit it. And so we see white grabbing a slight advantage in those last few moves. Okay. So h6 now. And here, with the knight on e5 attacked and the king on the e file, knight takes e6 is very tempting and was played. So if king takes, I guess we're going to see f4 to regain the piece. But actually bishop takes was played, rook takes. And if we look at the position here, we have got some weak pawns, well a6 in particular. The fifth rank control is impressive, the pressure is impressive, this is an isolated pawn. So we've got pawn structure damage. White's pawn structure is more solid and compact. So can black's pawn structure be frozen solid, literally, to lose even more flexibility, bits to start breaking off? It does seem as though, you know, there's this kind of bear grip about to happen on Judith's position. It's like, and pawns are about to be shaken forcibly off. So rook d8, and now the bear grip starts. f4, immediate threat, f5 maybe. Or can it be ignored because of king f6 or king d6 attacking this rook? So at the moment f5 isn't critical to address, or is it? But rook b5 nevertheless attacking that rook anyway. The rook is supported. Now the king gets out of the way. King f6, bishop f3. So white maintains here an iron grip on the e5 square. c5. Now a4. Okay, evicting the rook. Is it going to go backwards or forwards? It goes actually forwards, attacking the pawn, but sacrificing c5. Now with c5 dropping, will d4 be weaker, or will there be greater access maybe to a6 at some point? Rook takes c5, rook takes a4. b3, restricting the scope of the bishop here, asking the rook where it wants to go. Rook b4. And now the bear grip increases with bishop e4. Nice blockade, bishop d3. Blockade square, and it would target a6 as well. So a6 and h6 look as though they're going to be targets pretty soon. Bishop g4 attacking the rook. Rook e1. Rook d6 trying to sort of take care maybe of both pawns from d6. Bishop d3 starting to eye these vulnerabilities. The bear grip though, the restraint, the blockade literally on the d pawn, and the blockader is also eyeing a6 at the moment. The rook on c5 is also able to get a friend on the 5th rank. So there's a bear grip on the 5th rank on the d pawn, and a6 is on the fire. h6 is isolated. Black is running out of play, it seems here. Bishop d7, and the rooks don't seem that impressive either. The other rook joins on the 5th rank, so giving white options like to try and challenge the rook maybe to get one pair of rooks off. That option is stopped anyway. Bishop e6. Now the king comes in with king d2. Okay, the rook goes defensively, rook b to b6. Now further putting more pressure on that poor a6 pawn. So white's play seems to be without too much risk, solid, positional, freezing black's pawn structure now. Both these pawns locked, tight, blockaded. The water is starting to fill the freeze. Fluidity is dropping off here. Rook b c6, and now these rooks meekly defending a6 are in for more pressure after rook a4, because now this rook can switch to a5 maybe to hit a6 even harder. Rook b6, but actually it's not chosen now to play rook e5. That might be a reasonable move. We need to check it. In fact, rook e4 was chosen in the game because actually this is more exploitable all of a sudden. How does black defend d4 here? Whoa, it's winning a pawn. That's pretty nasty. So you might wonder, that rook a4 is actually dual purpose. It seems like it was just facilitating rook a5. It's also putting firepower on d4. So both of these pawns just being victimized in this position ruthlessly without black having counterplay to speak of. So forcibly white is winning a pawn. What's the evaluation here after rook a4? It's nearly 2 pawns advantage to white. Poor Judit. 27-10 has been reduced to this state of affairs where the pawns have been frozen solid and now being ripped off the board by force. So losing an important centre pawn now of course means there's a dangerous pass pawn here. Of course there's a 3-2 on this side as well. So rook e6, and now the bishop could also come more aggressively to c4. So even potentially eyeing f7 if black's not careful. So rook e6, rook a5, and now it looks as though bishop f7 and rook f5 might be on the cards in some variations anyway. So the bishop seems to be feeling an icy wind from the left here. So it goes away from that. Bishop c8. Bishop comes back to d3 now. White's conquering more and more space. And now the rook can also look at the h6 pawn. Black seems to be just helpless here. Bishop e6. And now rook d8, giving options of say rook h8 or rook a8. So which pawn to attack? There's so many options. Bishop c8. Quite a sadistic position. Rook ad5. Okay, so if one of these rooks dare to move, then there's an option for rook d6. It's creating options all the time and keeping options open like rook h8. So bishop e6, and now using this d rook to attack the poor h6 pawn. I've never seen a pawn where pawns are so victimized everywhere. It's horrible. But now there's a crushing tactic after king g7 played. Black is overloaded now. f5 is played and Judit is forced to resign. And you might wonder why. Why is Judit forced to resign here? The bishop's only got one square. It can only go to it can't go to d5 because the rook takes d5. It has to go to c8. So if bishop c8, unfortunately, I'm going to test you guys. If I give you 20 seconds here, do you see a crushing move for white? So 20 seconds starting from now. What would have been this winning game continuation? Okay, congratulations if you spotted the combinatory sequence here. It initiates with f6. The king has got no squares here, it's been trapped. There's no, the bishop's covering h7, it has to take the pawn. The rook can't take without dropping the bishop. And then rook takes c8 would be crushing. Because rook takes c8, rook takes h6 check, winning this rook. It's really bad, isn't it? It's really bad. Rook takes c8, just leaving a rook loose. It's a really controlled, clinical crush, this game. Very, very impressive. If we look again, how black's pawns were clamped down, sort of as if it was a bit analogous to a Dutch stonewall where you'd play on the dark squares, you'd exchange off the dark square defender, dark square bishops, try and clamp down on dark squares. The possibility of knight d5 is interesting to consider. That might be one of Judit's better options. Unless both players had analysed this at home, or maybe Yifan Hou had analysed this at home, this knight d5 is worthy of consideration maybe. The opportunity of that is taken away as the rook retreats. So g5, I don't know if this is creating weaknesses in the long term, this g5. Knight a4, just play on the dark square seems very logical, and it's going to target d7, d5, making the pawn kind of safer. It's going to have to play d5 if knight c5 maybe is arriving, and also a6 will be under pressure with a knight on c5. g3 evicting the knight. Then we saw rook e1, the odd looking bishop h5, but it gives the option to just get rid of that knight if the opportunity is favourable. So here, instead of knight c5 or a temporary pawn sack, no need for any temporary pawn sack, just knight c3. And this seems to be the critical blunder overextending black's position now. Black's triangle is relatively solid. The d4 pawn seems a bit weaker in the long term here to play d4. We can describe this as the losing move, in fact. I think this is the start of the downhill slide, d4 here. These other moves keep the advantage absolutely minimal. From a technical point of view, it seems this e5 is very good. Maybe it was missed. It gives the e4 square for the knight. No retreat needed for the knight. It can go and win the g5 pawn now after this check. And white's advantage is more pronounced. What's happened here is basically there's a d pawn which is easier to exploit than when it was on d5. The king safety is a bit weaker as well, especially after knight e6 now, this continuation. So we've got a combination of play on weaknesses a6 and d4. Very, very clinical looking game. In fact, restraint, blockade. Maybe this is like a modern interpretation, you know, like freezing water and then breaking off ice cubes, namely winning pawns. So this d4 is going to be under fire very soon. So the key move, which basically threatens to either double on this or attack this, is coming up here. The key move in this game will be this rook a4 move, putting pressure on both weaknesses with this way and this way to facilitate rook a5 and rook e4. So both rooks working together on both of these weaknesses here after rook b6. Very, very clinical play. Bear grip, absolute bear grip here. There's no escape from this grip, it seems. So just forcibly losing a pawn, it's brutal. There's just no counterplay, no excitement in black's play here available. This is the sort of position Grandmaster Nunn has written, you know, grandmasters avoid positions without counterplay like the plague. But unfortunately there was no counterplay, and a quick termination of the game now tactically after f5, with the implication of f6 check at bishop c8. So Judit was forced to resign here. So it seems we have an extremely worthy women's world champion, very young, I think just 17 or something, very, very young, very high rated, but maybe even totally underrated. The performance in Gibraltar so far has been absolutely staggering. I think we should look at some other games of hers. Absolutely crisp, clinical crush without any counterplay. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.